Holy Gospel of our Savior Jesus Christ according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go your way. Your faith has made you well." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
I speak to you in the name of one God, who is Father, and Son, and Spirit.
Amen.
I'm going to be preaching about Jesus, but I can't let the story that we have in Kings go by. Naaman is this person that we can identify with in many ways, especially for what he wants salvation to be. He wants it to be difficult. He wants there to be a cost. He would gladly have had some magic potion and dance make him clean, but it was easy. It was simple, and he doesn't trust it. He doesn't trust that it is easy and simple and straightforward, that God would simply forgive, that God would simply heal. And we do that for ourselves as well as we do for other people. We don't want other people to have it as, if we had a difficult time coming to faith, we don't want necessarily for them to have an easy road in. We want them to go through the same trials and tribulations that we went through. It goes a number of directions. So pay attention to that story. Go back and reread it. See where you show up in that wonderful story of healing and grace and thanksgiving. But when I was growing up, I was fortunate to be in a family, well, with my grandparents at least, who valued stories from the Bible. And so I knew what lepers were. I knew all about lepers. Lepers are in all of these stories, the stories that Jesus tells, as well as the stories that Jesus would have learned, the stories of ancient Israel. We know about lepers if you're familiar with the Bible narrative. But yet there was so much that they didn't know about leprosy. And so as we evolved and as we matured as civilizations, as we learned about medicine and health, leprosy kind of faded away, but we still had this image of the leper, of the person. And they're this mysterious person who walks around maybe hunched over or in rags saying, "Unclean, unclean." It's been in movies, it's in stories. So I think it's important to go back and think about what it is that Jesus is healing at that moment. Lepers absolutely were asked to be separated from the community. And that was probably the biggest price to pay on top of their health and well-being. Leprosy at that time was a range of illnesses and conditions. There is a specific condition of leprosy that we're familiar with now. It's treatable. It's still a little bit contagious if you're really close to somebody, but not very contagious. That person can still go to school, go to work, things like that, and they can be treated, but it affects the skin and affects the nerves so that you don't feel things when they're hurting you, and you end up having lesions or parts of your body are damaged and things like that. So it can progress if untreated. But it's something that today, thanks to science, thanks to our understanding, it's manageable. But for a long time, it wasn't just this illness of leprosy. It was almost any skin condition that looked dangerous. A bad rash that you maybe looked bad enough that you wanted to steer clear of. But more importantly, these individuals were not just medically unwell, but they were ritually unclean. They couldn't approach the temple in community. They couldn't worship with their peers and their families because there was something about their body that they could not enter into a holy space. We do that for ourselves when we're unwell enough to come into this gathering. But there were rules about if there was an open wound, if there was lesions on the skin. You couldn't go into this space that was supposed to be holy and set apart for one purpose only. And so you were ritually unclean, and when you were healed of that illness, that temporary illness, as we sometimes are, thanks be to God, you went and you had to show yourself to the priest that I'm healed, I can re-enter this community. And that was part of the process. In leprosy, too, because it was this catch-all of several different conditions and illnesses, people were often lepers who were cured or who were healed and were re-entering the community. But in order to keep the whole community safe from what at that time was a scary thing that was contagious and that was dangerous, they didn't have an app that told them they were too close to a leper. They didn't have a registration about these are the people who are lepers in this region. They actually had to seclude themselves and wear a particular dress that identified themselves as a leper. The rule was that they had to wear torn clothing, so rags. And they had to announce themselves that they are unclean if somebody got too close. Hey, you want to keep your distance. Because coming too close, it might not even make you contagious. It might not put you in a position where you would catch what I might have, but it makes you also ritually unclean to enter the temple, that holy space, if you cross this line into an unholy space. And so it was very important for people staying clean ritually. But when they were healed, they were restored. They presented themselves to the priest and they rolled up their sleeves and they showed that they're better. And the priest says, yes, you are. God has healed you. And they gave a thanksgiving offering to God and they re-entered the community. And that's one of the really important things for these people who were wandering around, isolated with only themselves in this colony of lepers. We talk about leper colonies, and that was a real thing. They could only gather together because they were the only ones that they could approach and come close to. They were dead, essentially. They were the equivalent of a dead body to those who wanted to stay clean. They couldn't be touched. If they were touched, if they were approached, that person was also defiled. And so these individuals who were being healed were being brought from a type of death back into a type of life. And that's an important note to keep in your mind as you hear this story, this transition from death into life. And we can overlay a whole lot about what we know about Jesus and what we know about what God does for us in this story. But I think that we rush to the end sometimes to the thankfulness. And we don't sit with what it would mean to go from death back into life. What it might mean for us who have experienced a kind of death in our lives. A kind of brokenness that goes down so deeply that we feel as if we are dead. And then, through grace, to re-enter a life where we know God's grace and God's goodness. That's a powerful transition that we don't want to lose in this story. It is really important to understand what healing means in this story, but also for Jesus as a whole. The word that he always uses for healing, and what we see in this text, especially at the end, your faith has made you well, is the same word that's used for being saved from something. It's also the same word that means to be made whole or complete. Sozo is the Greek word. Sozo. It's a wonderful little word. Can you say it? Sozo. It's a powerful word. It's one of those words that has really deep meanings. It means to be made whole, as if you've been missing something and you're being stitched back together. It also means to be made well, complete, healthy. It also means to save something, to rescue something. And at the end of this story, the one who comes back to thank Jesus, Jesus says, your faith has made you sozo. Your faith has made you whole, well. Your faith has saved you, but not, we think of saving as being from a particular end, but this is about saving for your life that is just beginning because you've been rescued from death and made whole. And the way that this wholeness is exhibited in this community is by being stitched back into the whole community, being made clean so that you can participate in community. You can be next to your peers in your family. You can worship together. And it is not just about worship, but it is about your identity as a whole community. You are being saved by being brought back to community when you were outside before, wandering like the dead. And that's powerful. It is to me. I know that there are many of us who have experienced a kind of death. I know that I have. I know that I've been gutted to the core. But also, and I don't talk about this story much. I'm not gonna, it's a longer story, so we're just going to get a snippet. But I drowned when I was 7 and had to be rescued and brought back to life. And Jesus doesn't differentiate those kinds of deaths. The life that Jesus wants to give, the life that God calls us into, is just as vital as if we had literally been raised from the dead and stitched back into community. And then after those individuals notice their healing, notice that they are on the way to be welcomed back in the community, and notice, you can have fun with this tonight if you want to. Find out where Jesus heals them. Find out where in that story Jesus heals them. You don't see it. You don't see him reach out a hand because he couldn't touch them. They were at a distance. He doesn't even say, you're healed. He doesn't even say, like he says to somebody else, get up off your mat and walk. He doesn't say, cast off your dirty rags and go. He doesn't even have any of those things. He just says, go and present yourself to the priest. As if you were healed. And they do. And as they turn, they notice that they are well. As they walk, they notice. Sometimes life is one of those gradual movements toward healing. It's not that dramatic thunderclap that we wish it were sometimes. And that's an important thread in this story, and I couldn't help but remind you of that. But in response to that healing, one of them comes back to give thanks. And so the other theme of this story, besides the healing and the death and the life, is the thanksgiving and the gratitude. And we're well aware of that. I think that's what many of us carry as the point of this story, as the thing that we learn and remember of this story. And so just like we talked about leprosy and death and healing, let's talk for a moment about Thanksgiving. When Jesus teaches us to pray, do you know the prayer that he teaches us? How does it begin? What are the first two words? Our Father. Yeah. Where in there does he teach us how to say thanks? Linda, you studied that prayer, I know, right? You're shaking your head, no, right? It's not in there. When Jesus teaches us how to pray, he doesn't tell us to say thank you. Sit with that for a second. Is that surprising to you? Yeah. When Jesus teaches us how to pray, he doesn't teach us how to say thank you in that prayer. So let's take a lesson from the leper who had been treated as dead and was now alive. And not only was he a leper, he was a Samaritan. And in the Jewish community in Galilee, he would have been a foreigner. And Jesus calls him that, doesn't he? This foreigner. He was doubly out of the community. If he went to his own priest, he might have been able to re-enter that community, but maybe he was going to the priest that Jesus had told him to go to, that the others had wanted to go to. Would that person have allowed him to come back in the community? We don't know. There are a lot of unanswered things about this parable. But this is somebody who was doubly dead, doubly outside of community, who noticed that all of a sudden now he was healed. And so he comes back to Jesus. And he prostrates himself. He lays down on the ground at Jesus' feet. And another interesting wordplay in this gospel message is the text doesn't actually say that he said thanks. It doesn't actually say that he even was thankful, like a feeling. It said that he was giving thanksgiving. He was in the process of everything that he was doing was thanksgiving to God. There wasn't a particular prayer that he said, but it was his very actions, his very life, his very act of returning that was worship. That was turning his attention to the God who had given him what he needed. Many times, the things that we do with our lives are our very prayer that we offer to God. It is not necessarily the words that we say or that we remember or that we write down, but it is the very act of being in the world as faithful people that is itself a thanksgiving for what God has given us. It is a return to God and to God's creation from what God has given to us. You know, every Sunday and every time that we gather, we come into a space like this and we do something called liturgy. And I have always talked about how liturgy is an embodiment of our prayers. It is a time when our bodies are here for a particular reason, to orient ourselves toward God, towards what God does at that table. We draw our attention to the God who gives of God's self for us, not only in the person of Jesus, but especially in the person of Jesus, who gives of God's self into the world. And we come together and we embody a prayer of thanksgiving. Remember, Eucharist is the word for thanksgiving. As we receive what God has given us. And we take that and then proceed into the world. In these spaces, we practice the prayers that we hope to live with our lives. practice the prayers that we hope to live with our lives. That is what Thanksgiving does, is it turns our attention toward a practice of gratitude, of thanksgiving, for the healing that we have experienced, being drawn in not just to this community, but being stitched into a life that is at union with God, who is showering God's love on all of creation. Not just each of us individually, but as a unit. And we, when we are healed, when we are whole, recognize that God is stitching us back into creation and calling us to live lives of thanksgiving, to give out of our abundance, to share with one another in our hurts and in our deaths, and to recognize that ultimately for God there is no boundary between clean and unclean. There is no boundary between us and them, the outside and the inside, because God is healing all of it. God is bringing it all back together, as God always intended. And we can say thanks be to God.